Welcome to another deep dive. This one might just make you feel a little bit young.
Oh,
Today we're exploring the lifespans of the first humans mentioned in the Bible.
the first humans.
Yeah. You know those folks from the book of Genesis?
Okay.
Chapter 5, to be exact.
Genesis chapter 5, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about Adam and Eve and all those folks.
Right.
We're going to be looking at the King James Version,
Okay.
along with some commentary from Matthew Henry, written back in 1710.
1710.
And I think even those who are familiar with the Bible, might be surprised by just how long these early humans were said to have lived. We're talking some serious longevity here.
Yeah, you're not kidding. I mean, centuries, not decades.
Centuries.
And that raises some questions right away. I mean, how should we interpret these accounts? Were people really that healthy back then? Or is there something, deeper behind these extraordinary lifespans?
Yeah. Let's start with Adam,
Okay.
the first man. The Bible says he lived for 930 years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost a millennium. It's pretty mind-blowing. Mind-blowing when you think about it. And the Bible doesn't come right out and say why he lived so long. But, there are some interpretations out there.
Okay.
Some scholars suggest it could be linked to the pre-flood conditions on Earth.
Okay.
The idea is that the environment might have been vastly different before the flood.
Yeah.
Maybe even more conducive to longevity.
So maybe the air was cleaner?
Yeah. No smog or traffic fumes.
Yeah.
There's also the idea that humans had the potential for greater longevity before the fall of man.
Mm.
That whole thing with the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden.
Oh, yeah. The apple incident.
Right. So the fall of man is seen by many as a turning point in human history.
Okay.
And it's the moment when sin entered the world. And some believe that it also marked a shift in our physical nature,
Okay.
including our lifespans.
So before the apple, humans were practically immortal.
Well, not exactly immortal, but perhaps capable of living much longer.
Okay.
Now, this raises another question.
Yeah.
If Adam was created with the potential for such a long life, but then sinned,
Right.
what does that mean for his experience of time?
Right. It's a long time to live with a bad decision,
Oh, and Matthew Henry,
Yeah.
in his commentary, really digs into this.
Okay.
He points out that even though Adam lived for so long, he was still subject to death from the moment he disobeyed God. And Henry describes it as a sort of dying by degrees.
So even with centuries ahead of him, there was this looming awareness of his own mortality.
Yeah.
That's kind of heavy. I mean, is it like, do you appreciate each day more, or does the weight of all those years ahead of you make it harder to enjoy the present?
It's a fascinating perspective.
Yeah.
And this theme of mortality amidst these long lifespans continues as we look at Adam's descendants.
Yeah.
His son Seth lived to be 912.
Wow.
Enos to 905, and so on. It wasn't just Adam. It seems like this incredible longevity was a pattern in those early generations.
So living for hundreds of years was like a family trait.
Well, it's an interesting thought experiment. But let's not get too hung up on the literal years.
Yeah.
I think the real question here is, what might these extended lifespans symbolize? What can they tell us about the human condition at that time?
Yeah, maybe it's not about the number of years, but about what they did with all that time.
Right.
And having generations upon generations living at the same time must have had a huge impact on how knowledge was passed down.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine the stories, the wisdom, the history that could be shared directly from those who lived it.
Exactly. And Matthew Henry actually notes this in his commentary. He suggests that these long lives might have allowed for an incredible transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next,
Right.
especially since these figures were all alive during Adam's lifetime.
It's like having a living library
Right.
of human experience. Could you imagine having your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather around to tell you about the good old days? Talk about a family reunion.
It definitely paints a vivid picture. A time when history and tradition were experienced in a completely different way than they are today. But here's where things get really interesting. Enoch the seventh from Adam breaks the mold a bit.
Okay.
He only lived for 365 years.
Wait, only 365 years. I mean, that's still way longer than anyone lives today.
Oh, absolutely.
But compared to his family, it's practically a short life. What happened? Did he forget to take his vitamins or something?
It's not about the length of his life, but rather how it ended.
Okay.
Enoch didn't die in the conventional sense. The Bible tells us that God took him.
Okay. Now that's intriguing. So where did he go? Was it like an express elevator to heaven?
That's a question that has fascinated theologians and scholars for centuries. The Bible describes Enoch as someone who walked with God.
Okay.
which suggests a deep level of righteousness and communion with the divine.
So he was like the ultimate good guy.
He was a good guy.
So good that God was just like, all right, come on, we're skipping the whole death thing and taking you straight home.
It's certainly a unique story, and it opens up a whole other line of questioning about the relationship between humans and the divine in those early days.
Right.
What does it mean to walk with God, and how does that connect to the idea of mortality? These are big questions, and we'll delve into them a bit more later on.
All right, so we've got Adam, who lived a long life, even with the shadow of his mistakes,
Right.
and his descendants, who inherited his longevity. And then we've got Enoch, who seems to have earned a special kind of early retirement plan.
Yes.
But what about the most famous, long-lived character of them all, Methuselah?
Methuselah.
He's the one everyone remembers because he lived to be 969, the longest lifespan in the Bible.
Yeah, yes, Methuselah. He's an incredibly interesting figure, and not just because of his age. What's really fascinating is that his name is connected to the coming of the flood in some interpretations.
Wait, what? Like, his name is a secret code for the flood?
Not exactly a code, but some scholars believe there's a symbolic connection. It's as if his death was a sign or maybe even a catalyst for this world-altering event.
So when Methuselah took his final breath, the heavens opened up. That's heavy stuff. It's almost like a doomsday prophecy.
It certainly adds another layer of intrigue to his story.
Yeah.
And speaking of foreshadowing, let's move on to Lamech,
Okay.
Noah's father.
Okay.
He lived a respectable 777 years.
777, huh? Is that a lucky number?
Perhaps. But what's really interesting about Lamech are the words he speaks when Noah is born.
Okay.
He says, "This same shall comfort us concerning our work and toil of our hands, because of the ground which the Lord hath cursed."
Okay. That's a pretty cryptic statement for a new dad. Is he just being hopeful, or is there something more to it?
Well, some scholars believe that Lamech's words might be more than just a father's wish for his son.
Okay.
They might actually be a subtle prophecy, hinting at the relief that Noah would bring to humanity after the flood. Remember, the ground was cursed after Adam's disobedience.
Right.
And Lamech seems to be saying that Noah will be instrumental in easing that curse.
So even from birth, Noah was destined for greatness.
It certainly seems that way. And this brings us to another interesting point. Noah was already 500 years old when he had his sons. Talk about a late bloomer.
500 years old. I can barely keep a houseplant alive for a year. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? We think of 50 as middle-aged, but in Noah's time, it seems like he was just getting started.
Exactly. These lifespans challenge our modern perception of time and aging. What if our lives unfolded on a much grander scale, with centuries stretching out before us? What would we prioritize? What would we accomplish? It's almost impossible to imagine.
It's mind-boggling to think about living for 500 years and only then starting what we would consider a major life project. And it really makes you question what a normal lifespan might have been like back then.
It certainly throws our modern concept of time out the window. And if we try to connect these incredible lifespans to the bigger picture, they might offer us a glimpse into a time when the relationship between humans and God was perceived in a very different way.
So was God more present in their daily lives? Like if you're living for 900 years, going to church on Sunday seems like a much smaller commitment.
It's an interesting thought. While we can't know for sure, the text does suggest a different kind of connection.
Right.
Remember Enoch who walked with God.
Right.
That phrase really stands out. It implies a level of intimacy and closeness that's hard to grasp from our modern perspective.
Yeah, totally. And even though Adam messed things up with that whole forbidden fruit situation, his descendants still lived for centuries. It makes you wonder if maybe the consequences of sin weren't as immediately apparent back then. Maybe there was like a period of grace, a kind of buffer zone where humans were still reaping the benefits of a pre-fall world.
That's a really interesting point. It's like maybe the effects of sin were more gradual, a slow burn rather than an immediate catastrophe. And Matthew Henry, in his commentary, really highlights this tension between human sinfulness and the continued blessing of these long lifespans. He suggests that those lengthy lives were a testament to God's mercy and patience, even in the face of disobedience.
So even though humanity was flawed from the beginning, God was still extending a hand, hoping they'd figure things out.
It's possible, but it's also important to consider how those lifespans might have shaped their whole worldview. Imagine the accumulation of knowledge, the passing down of stories and traditions through countless generations. Their understanding of time history and even their own mortality would have been drastically different from ours.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine having your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather still around to tell you stories about Adam and Eve. It would be like having a direct link to the dawn of humanity.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Noah. Remember, he was 500 years old when he started building the ark.
Right.
In Noah's context, 500 years might have been considered the prime of life,
Hmm.
the perfect time to embark on a truly monumental task.
So maybe we shouldn't compare our 21st century anxieties about aging to people who are living 10 times longer. They're playing a completely different game.
It's a good reminder to reconsider our own perspectives on aging and our place within the grand scheme of time. If we can step outside our modern mindset, we might find a sense of awe and wonder in these accounts from Genesis. They remind us that the human experience has unfolded in ways we can barely begin to grasp.
It's like peering through a window into a different reality. One where time moved slower and the lines between life and death, the human and the divine, were perhaps more fluid.
Precisely. And it raises a big question. How does understanding this ancient perspective influence our own understanding of the world and our place within it?
That's a fantastic question. So what stands out to you from all this? What's the most mind-blowing takeaway?
For me, it's the profound shift in perspective it offers. It's a reminder that our understanding of the world is limited by our own experience of time. The book of Genesis challenges us to consider the possibility of different realities, different ways of being human, and different relationships with the divine.
We're so accustomed to thinking in terms of decades, maybe a century if we're lucky.
Exactly. Imagine the implications for storytelling, for the passing down of wisdom and knowledge. Their understanding of history and tradition would have been so much richer, so much more layered.
It makes you wonder, what was lost when human lifespans started to shrink? Did we lose something essential about our connection to the past, to our ancestors, and maybe even to God?
That's a profound question,
Yeah.
and one that I think we need to explore a bit further.
Yeah, it feels like we're only seeing a tiny little part of it.
It's a great way to put it, and that's what makes these accounts so captivating. They challenge us to confront the limits of our understanding, to wrestle with ideas that defy easy explanation.
Okay, so we've got these incredible lifespans,
Right.
this possibility that people aged differently back then, and this potential for a completely different way of understanding time and history.
Yeah.
What does this all mean for us today? Why should we care about these stories from thousands of years ago?
That's the core question, isn't it? No matter how we interpret these accounts, they raise these fundamental questions
Right.
about the very nature of time mortality and the relationship between humanity and the divine. And those are questions that are just as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago.
Right. So even if we don't take the lifespans literally, they still have something to teach us about our own lives
Absolutely.
and our own search for meaning.
For example, the idea of walking with God, as exemplified by Enoch, goes beyond the specifics of his story.
Right.
It invites us to consider what it means to live a life of integrity, purpose, and connection to something bigger than ourselves.
As like maybe it's not about how long we live, but the quality of our lives, the depth of our connections, and the impact we make on the world around us.
Precisely. It's a challenge to shift our focus
Right.
from quantity to quality, from striving for longevity to striving for a life that truly matters.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into these incredible lifespans from the book of Genesis, I have one final question for you, dear listener. If you could sit down with any of these figures, who would you choose? And what would you ask them? Would it be Adam, the first man? Enoch, who walked with God? Or maybe Methuselah, who witnessed centuries upon centuries of human history?
And maybe even more importantly, what does the idea of walking with God mean to you today? In a world that often feels chaotic and disconnected, how can we cultivate a sense of purpose, meaning, and connection that transcends the limitations of our own fleeting lifespans? Those are questions worth pondering, perhaps even more so than the mystery of those long, long lives from so long ago.
That's a perfect thought to leave us with. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.